Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today on the program, we are talking about what's happening in the Middle East. We're talking about how media and politicians gave Israel basically a green light to do what they're doing in Gaza, how media outlets have worked with Israel against Gaza. We'll be talking about the propaganda blitz on how establishment press is pushing actually fake stories about what's happening in Gaza. And those of you that are regular listeners here to the program and also regular consumers of independent media may realize I'm riffing around a news source that we feature here at the project often, and that would be mintpressnews.com. I was just rattling off a list of some of their latest headlines that, of course, always gets them in some degree of hot water with the powers that be in big tech and the censorship industrial complex. We are honored to welcome back to the program the Editor-in-Chief of MintPress News, as well as the president of the nonprofit behind the headlines, Mnar Adley. Mnar, it is an honor to have you on the program. I know how busy you've been in these last couple of whirlwind weeks. It's been traumatic and tragic in many ways, and I know that you're going to talk to us about that both personally and professionally today. But thank you so much for joining us on the Project Censored Show, Mnar.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you, Mickey.
So again, I was just rattling off a list of just some things at mintpress.com of what you've all been working on, just even in the past couple of weeks. But for years, you've been doing this kind of coverage at MintPress about Gaza, about the Israeli apartheid situation there. Could you tell us, Mnar, just from the gate, sort of your impression of what's been happening around the October 7 attacks and retaliations from Hamas based on Israeli occupation and settler colonialism, and just walk us into this and tell us some things that you've been covering at MintPress that we obviously aren't seeing in the corporate media. Mnar Adley.
Yeah, well, it's been 2 weeks since the attack against the kibbutz happened on October 7th, and the media is framing this as a war between Hamas and Israel. But in reality, what we're witnessing in real time on live TV is a war of aggression by the state of Israel, which is a colonizer. It's an apartheid state. It's the sixth strongest and largest military force in the world that's being armed by the largest military force in the world. And it has launched a war of aggression against the world's largest concentration camp in Gaza. And what we know about Gaza is that there are about 2.3 million people living there, 50% of whom are children, are under the age of 18. And the majority of people living in Gaza are actually refugees. And when Hamas broke through the Gaza fence and sailed to the Israeli kibbutz, and Palestinians broke the Gaza border, what wasn't being reported on is that these people were actually breaking out of the world's largest open air prison, and they were so happy to finally be free from a prison where they had been ethnically cleansed into, out of their homes from the Israeli settlements that were right outside of that Gaza fence. And so the truth is that the media keeps leading with this headline that what happened on October 7th, they've led with false stories of 40 beheaded babies, which CNN and even the White House have had to retract. They've led with stories of women being raped in mass, which now have also been retracted by major media outlets. And even the Israeli military has distanced itself from many of those initial claims. And what we are now learning from within the Israeli military itself is that they've actually released lists of the dead, showing that about 50% of the people that were killed on October 7th were actually soldiers and armed settlers, not civilians. And so there are still a lot of questions and question marks around what happened on October 7th. Now, did Hamas kill civilians? They did. Did they take captives? They did.
Yes.
But we have to recognize that everything that we are being told that was used to manufacture consent for Israel's very large and aggressive war of aggression against Gaza's civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves, where it has targeted hospitals, where it has targeted schools and UN facilities, where babies are being decapitated by the bombs being dropped on them. A lot of those stories turned out to be fake. And so just look at this from the bigger picture. This is an ongoing issue that did not start on October 7th, but an issue of settler colonialism that has been going on by the Israeli state for the past 75 years. And so I just ask everybody to read and consume the news with, with a critical lens, and know that there is more to the narrative than meets the eye.
Well, critical media literacy education is all about this, and it's particularly significant in terms of the reporting about marginalized communities, oppressed peoples. Andy Lee Roth was on earlier talking about the Orwellian concept of unpersons and unhistory. In a lot of ways, the things that go down the memory hole that we're not allowed to see or talk about. And of course, Chomsky and Herman, Noam Chomsky, Edward Herman, also talked about the problems of unworthy victims, worthy versus unworthy victims in the media. And this was a textbook example out of the gate where the Western press, of course, was rightfully decrying the carnage of innocent Israeli citizens at the hands of Hamas, but they were doing it contextlessly, like completely out of context, no history. I mean, granted, it's an atrocity, not saying it isn't, but the retaliation and the revenge that's been meted in the ensuing couple of weeks, not to mention the decades of oppression and carnage prior. Again, it's an exercise in establishment propaganda in support of the status quo. That's why it's so difficult to see so many educated, I mean, this is the problem, as Chomsky would say, it's among the most educated classes that are most successfully propagandized. But we see, even in the White House press corps, there are establishment journalists questioning Secretary of State Blinken and others saying, are you trying to say that these people haven't died in Palestine when they talk about the 7,000 people at least that are killed? I mean, again, we play the numbers game, which I think detracts away from the lack of humanity and the loss of human life here in a lot of ways. But even at the end of it all, in the recent press conference, the establishment, the U.S. government, admitted that thousands of people were dying, and they just skirted the question because you can't trust Hamas as a source. So, Mnar Adley, unpack some of that propaganda that we're really up against. And even when the establishment propaganda mechanisms admit that this is happening, it doesn't seem to change the perspective of people here. Or do you think the perspectives of people in the U.S. are gradually changing about the Israeli occupation? Mnar Adley.
I do think that people en masse are starting to become more conscious of Israel's actions towards Palestinians and starting to understand that this is a crisis of apartheid and of modern-day colonialism and occupation. Polls actually show that those who support Israel are typically people over the age of 65 in this country. And we've seen that with the massive show of protests across the country, and students going, performing walkouts from their universities and from their schools. And these just cannot be compared to the very, very small pro-Israel protests that are taking place in this country. And so what we are seeing within the media is a narrative and propaganda by the corporate mainstream media to show worthy versus unworthy victims. Israelis were killed versus Palestinians merely died. I mean,
right.
Exactly. Those are the words, and that's the headline that was actually on the BBC after Israel pummeled Gaza, the world's largest open-air prison, within the first couple of days after October 7th, when Israel launched its aggressive crusade into Gaza. And also we saw many instances from the New York Post to other outlets on social media even, leading with images of injured Palestinian children, covered in dust and being pulled out of the rubble while reporting on unverified crimes being committed by Hamas. And so We are witnessing a propaganda blitz by the mainstream corporate media. Again, with the 40 beheaded babies story, I think it's really important that we talk about this because this was one of the leading stories that was used to manufacture consent for Israel to launch its military campaign into Gaza. It was used to dehumanize Palestinians, to showcase Palestinians as barbaric, as backwards, as baby killers. And yet that story turned out to be false. It was sourced from I-24 News. It's an Israeli news TV station, which is directly funded by the Netanyahu family. And
is there any warning about that? Is there any social media
No.
warning about that site, or are they flagged by NewsGuard, Mnar?
No, they're not flagged.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought one standard. I thought one standard might apply for organizations that way across the list, but I was naive.
No, and you know, I'm talking about news organizations that are being flagged. Right now, we're watching in real time corporate media pushing out fake news stories from CNN to Politico. Politico just yesterday, I was reading one of their articles. The first line of their article yesterday, October 26th, read the line about the 40 beheaded babies, even after the White House has retracted that claim, even after CNN has retracted that claim. And even now, the Israeli military, because they cannot show any evidence for it, have now backed off of that claim as well. And we have mainstream corporate outlets in the United States still pushing those stories. And it serves, racist tropes.
Absolutely.
Muslims.
Well, Mnar, what we know from the social science research on this is that once these stories get out, the retractions don't get anywhere near the reading. They don't get anywhere near the audience. Once an audience hears something, and especially if it appeals to their confirmation bias because they've heard the narrative before, it's almost impossible to go back and tell them that something they heard was false, right? Exactly. And we can go back to 1710 and Jonathan Swift, right? Falsehoods fly and the truth comes limping after. In the era of social media, that's even more so, right? That these stories get around. And look, since World War I, we've been dealing with, the Germans, killing Belgian babies or ripping the arms off of Belgian babies, or Naira, the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, lying to Congress about Iraqis throwing kids out of incubators. These kinds of stories that demonize, otherize, and the enemy. I mean, they're old. This is, again, back to the worthy, unworthy victim strategy. And Mnar, it's not just then that the establishment press is pumping out false stories, but also alternative sources like your own at MintPress are being censored. So can you talk to us about recent examples of where you have experienced censorship or deplatforming or any other kind of big tech chicanery that silences your voice?
Yeah, and before I answer that, I just want to make one quick comment about why this 40 beheaded baby story is so outrageous, because it goes to show just the asymmetry here that we're seeing with the coverage of Palestinian children being killed versus Israeli children being killed, who's worthy and who's unworthy. Right now, that story of the 40 beheaded children dying at the hands of Hamas has turned out to be fake and false news. It was used to justify Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And now there are hundreds of babies, premature babies in Palestine that are alive because of incubators. And this is a real story. And their life is about to end because Israel has cut off electricity to all of Gaza. They've cut out the fuel. And so the hospitals there are about to collapse if they haven't already. In fact, just about an hour ago, I'm looking at the clock here, we received news that all of telecommunications cables in Gaza have been cut because of Israel raining bombs on Gaza right now. So the internet has been cut off and all electricity and all telecommunications to the outside world have been cut off. And 3,000 children have been killed by these US supplied bombs that Israel is dropping on Gaza right now. And so if we want to talk about the children that have been targeted, it is the Palestinian children in Gaza that are being killed. And we do know that nearly 1,000 babies have also been killed in Gaza so far since October 7th.
And we know the IDF has been
is just
shooting.
disturbing.
And we have reports of IDF people shooting Israelis and killing Israelis.
Right, and that's yes. The Hannibal Directive was used. It's a directive that is used by the Israeli military that basically says to the military that it's better for the Israeli military to shoot at other Israelis, even if the enemy is there behind them. And so what we saw on October 7th, and this is, again, these are not my words, this is coming out of the Israeli military reports themselves, that directive was used that day. So a lot of the 50% of the people killed on October 7th most likely died because of being stuck in the crossfire between Hamas shooters and Israeli military.
Yeah.
And so just to go back to the kind of censorship that we have faced,
yeah,
I just released a video yesterday titled Israel's Top War Crimes Committed in Gaza So Far, where I detail Israel committing genocide according to Article 6 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. I also detail about 8 other war crimes and other war crimes against humanity that Israel has committed, again, according to the Rome Statute and the UN Charter. So I detail all of this factual information, looking at what Israel has done in Gaza, from intentionally directing targets against civilian objects, deportation of forcible transfer of a population, from targeting personnel, installations, material, units, or vehicles involved in humanitarian assistance or peacekeeping missions where Israel has bombed humanitarian aid, convoys, food aid facilities. 22 UN facilities have been targeted and bombed. Israel's call for the north of Gaza to evacuate to the south of Gaza, that's over 1 million people, and giving them only a 3-hour window. These are all war crimes. And of course, the biggest one that or not the biggest one, but the one that we've seen consistently is the crime of apartheid. Well, this video, we uploaded it to Instagram and Facebook and to all the Meta platforms, and Meta took it down within 2 minutes. And the reasoning we were given, I was going to read it out here, is that the video promotes organizations or individuals deemed as dangerous. And it really goes to show that this is not just an attack on Palestinians, because this is humanizing Palestinians to show the world what Israel has done against Palestinians in Gaza, but it's also an attack on journalism, because I myself am an independent journalist and I'm simply doing my job to report on how Israel is violating international law. Unfortunately, what we have is a mainstream corporate media who are downplaying a lot of what Israel is doing in Gaza, and they're basically adding a disclaimer to any time that they report on what's happening in Gaza, to any of the atrocities that are carried out. They include a disclaimer saying that these atrocities are in response to Hamas attacks on October 7th. Well, it doesn't matter what they're in response to. In fact, what Israel is committing in Gaza are crimes against humanity. They are war crimes according to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Just yesterday, Israel targeted the family of Al Jazeera chief correspondent Wael Dahdouh. And in every single one of the coverage reports covering the story within mainstream corporate media, including CNN, they added the disclaimer that his family died in an airstrike by Israel, where Israel was targeting Hamas targets.
Yeah.
And so that's another disclaimer that they're being used. So what organizations like CNN and the BBC have done is they've framed these attacks on civilians as collateral damage, because Hamas exists beneath the feet of every Palestinian. I mean, that's how dehumanizing the narrative has been.
The language has
And
been grotesque. Yeah, the language.
well, and I
about
just want
demonizing.
to add one quick thing is that Israeli media just published last night a video interview with an Israeli politician that said, we know where we have a registry that tells us exactly where every single person lives in Gaza. And our target yesterday or that day was the family of Wa'il Dahdur. So on TV, Israel is admitting openly that they are targeting
journalists and their families.
Yeah. And yesterday, Israel didn't just target Wa'il Dahdouh's family, they also targeted several organizers of the Great Return March and their family. And that's what Israel is doing. These are targeted campaigns, targeted killings, just happening in plain sight. And the United States is abetting it and allowing it. And they're voting by the Biden administration is voting at the UN to
asking for billions more. And it's not just for Israel, it's for Ukraine, it's for Taiwan. It's, you know, the military industrial complex is high on the hog right now. And, you know, we're running out of time in the segment, Mnar, as usual, but, you know, it's also worth pointing out that there's a decent number of people, of course, in Israel that are opposed to all of this. I mean, there are people in Israel that are against all of this. They're not being represented.
They are a minority. There is a minority voice in the Israeli public that do oppose Israel's actions.
But they're cracking down there. They're cracking down on protests, on media. They're doing the same thing inside the country.
Well, and I was just about to say that they just voted inside the Israeli government if they should shoot Israeli citizens who come out to protest. And I think they're doing that. They did that vote. They held that vote to intimidate Israeli citizens from ever opposing what's happening in Gaza. And Israeli generals have said, if you want to oppose the war against Gaza, then we can bus you to Gaza.
Yeah. Well, that should tell us a lot in terms of that's some great punishment, which means the whole purpose is meting out punishment, vengeance, etc. Mnar Adley, your outlet has been one of the consistently few that has covered these issues. Alan McLeod, your senior writer, has brilliant media analysis day in and day out, particularly deconstructing the framing and propaganda of headlines from around the world, particularly in Western press. And I'd certainly encourage our listeners to check out the work of Alan McLeod, to check out the work of Mnar Adley and the work you've been doing too with Loki. You definitely are providing perspectives and information that are just nowhere really to be found in the establishment press in the US. And I think it's very important what you're doing. You've been experiencing censorship efforts for years now, and those are only likely intensifying. Mnar Adley, any last words for right now in this segment?
No, I think that we covered it all.
Yeah, so mintpressnews.com is where to go. Any other places you'd like for people to try to find you online while they're able, Mnar Adley?
Yeah, we're available on our website, mintpressnews.com, and all of the platforms, Instagram, Twitter. Just you can look up Mint Press News, and we're going to be more active, I think, on Rumble as we are facing this wave of censorship because of the partnership between Israel and big tech giants.
Yeah, which we've talked about on previous shows, but that's going on now writ large. The labeling, the framing, the suppression, the deplatforming, the demonetization, the shadow banning, all unfortunately terms that we're very well familiar with, Mnar Adley. Mnar Adley, Editor-in-Chief, Mint Press News, head of the nonprofit behind the headlines. You can learn more at mintpressnews.com. Mnar, as ever, thank you so much for the important work that you do in the realm of people's interest journalism.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.